The air was thick with the taste of salt as the wind howled across the island. Dark clouds loomed on the horizon, twisting and growing heavier as they approached. Sarah stood by the helipad, eyes locked on the churning sea below. Storms like this were unpredictable, merciless even. But there was something about this one that gnawed at her nerves. It was too familiar. The radio crackled to life, snapping her out of her thoughts. "We've got a situation, Sarah. One of the fishermen hasn't returned." She tightened her grip on the helmet in her hands, a familiar weight in times like these. "Who?" "James Carter. Took his boat out early this morning, hasn't been seen since." Sarah's heart gave a small jolt. She'd heard of James, though only in whispers. He kept to himself, a man who never asked for help, not even when it was obvious he needed it. It wasn't surprising that he'd be out in weather like this, but still, it didn't sit right with her. She hesitated, glancing up at the sky. The storm would only get worse from here, but waiting wasn't an option. Time was never on their side when it came to rescues at sea. "I'm on my way," she said, slipping the helmet over her head, pushing down the surge of anxiety that rose in her chest. The wind picked up as she climbed into the helicopter, engines roaring to life. The storm was coming fast, and every minute counted. As she ascended into the darkening sky, the only thought in her mind was simple. She had to find him. She wasn't going to let the sea claim another life. Not this time. The helicopter cut through the storm with sharp precision, though the winds fought hard to push it off course. Sarah kept her grip steady on the controls, her breath even, despite the tightening in her chest. She'd flown in weather like this before, but each time felt like testing fate. The ocean below was a roiling, dark mass, waves crashing against one another in chaos. Finding a single boat in that turmoil would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. "Sarah, do you have a visual?" The voice from the radio buzzed through her headset. "Not yet," she replied, scanning the horizon. "Visibility's rough, but I'm moving north along the current." He could have drifted that way. Her eyes darted back and forth, combing the vast expanse of water beneath her. It was moments like this, caught between hope and helplessness, that the memories tried to sneak in. The last time she had flown in a storm like this, her brother had been out there too. He had been swallowed by the sea before she could find him. "Not again," she whispered to herself. Then, through the veil of rain and mist, she spotted something, a faint outline. Her heart skipped. A small fishing boat, barely holding steady, tossed violently by the waves. It had to be him. "Got him!" Sarah called into the radio. "I'm moving in for a closer look." As she lowered the helicopter, the figure of a man became visible on the deck of the boat, clinging desperately to the side. James. His body was limp, barely holding on, but he was still alive. Relief flooded through her, but there was no time to linger on it. She positioned the helicopter carefully, preparing the harness for the rescue. She had found him. Now, she just had to bring him home. Sarah touched down on the island's helipad, the wind still howling as the storm intensified. Medics rushed to the helicopter as she opened the door, guiding James out carefully. His face was pale, and his body was soaked and trembling from the cold. But he was breathing. That was enough for now. "Get him to the clinic," Sarah instructed, watching as the medics loaded him onto a stretcher and hurried inside. She followed them closely, feeling a pull that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just duty driving her now. There was something about James that lingered in her mind. The way he clung to life out there, despite everything, struck a chord deep within her. The island's small clinic bustled with activity as they wheeled him in. Sarah stood at a distance, leaning against the doorframe. She could hear the whispers from the staff. "That's James Carter. Hasn't spoken to anyone in years. Lived alone since the accident." She didn't know the details, only fragments of the story. A man who had lost everything in a storm, much like the one that had nearly taken him today. Yet here he was, pulled from the same unforgiving sea that had already claimed so much of him. Sarah shook off the thoughts. There was no point getting drawn into someone else's tragedy. But as she looked through the small window into the clinic, watching James breathe shallowly, she knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The storm passed, leaving the island drenched but intact. James remained in the clinic, recovering slowly, but he never spoke a word. Sarah found herself visiting more often than she intended. At first, she told herself it was just to check on his progress. It was her responsibility, after all, to see that he pulled through. But as the days passed, she knew it was more than that. Each time she stepped into the clinic, he was there, eyes closed or staring blankly at the ceiling, lost in some distant place. It wasn't just physical wounds he was healing from, and Sarah could see that clearly. She'd seen it in herself once. One evening, she pulled a chair up beside his bed, not knowing exactly why. For a long while, there was only the sound of the clinic, soft footsteps, the beep of machines. Then, to her surprise, James spoke. "Why did you save me?" His voice was low, raspy, as though it had taken everything in him to ask the question. Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the sudden break in silence. "It's my job," she replied, though the words felt insufficient even as she said them. James didn't respond. He turned his head away, closing his eyes again, retreating back into his silence. But something had shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. Sarah felt it, and she knew that whatever he was hiding, whatever weighed him down, it wasn't going to stay buried forever. As the days went by, whispers about James circulated around the island. Sarah heard them in passing, bits and pieces of a tragedy that had left him isolated and broken. The islanders spoke cautiously about the man who had once been a part of their tight-knit community, before everything changed. One evening, as Sarah left the clinic, she ran into Tom, an older fisherman who had known James for years. He hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether he should share what he knew. "James wasn't always like this, you know," Tom began, his weathered face lined with concern. "He had a family, a wife, and a young son. They were everything to him." Sarah listened quietly, sensing the weight behind his words. "There was a storm, much like the one you found him in. They were out on his boat when it hit. James survived, but—" Tom paused, his voice thick with emotion. "His wife and boy didn't." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of the waves crashing against the shore. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her chest. Now she understood. James wasn't just fighting for his life that day. He was fighting against a sea that had already taken everything from him. "He blames himself," Tom added softly. "Always has. That's why he stayed away. Couldn't face anyone after that." Sarah nodded, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. The weight James carried was heavier than she had imagined. The clinic was quiet that evening, save for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors by James's bed. Sarah sat by his side, the silence between them heavier than usual. She had replayed Tom's words over and over in her mind. It all made sense now, James's isolation, his unwillingness to connect. But something told her there was more to the story. James shifted slightly in his bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He seemed distant, lost in the past. Sarah hesitated before speaking, unsure if she should break the fragile peace between them. "You don't have to talk about it," she finally said, her voice soft, almost tentative. To her surprise, James didn't brush her off. Instead, he turned his head slowly toward her, his expression hard, but the pain in his eyes unmistakable. He took a long breath, as though gathering the strength to speak. "I should have known," he began, his voice low and strained. "The storm was coming. I saw the signs, but I ignored them. I thought we'd be fine." Sarah's heart tightened, but she remained silent, letting him speak at his own pace. "It wasn't the storm that took them," he said, his voice breaking. "It was me. I wasn't paying attention, distracted by my own thoughts. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." He paused, the weight of the confession pressing down on him. "I was the one who let them die," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've been running from that ever since." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She could see now that James wasn't just running from the island, from the people who had once known him. He was running from himself, from the guilt that had consumed him for years. "I don't know how to fix that," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Maybe I never will." The air was thick again, heavy with the tension of an impending storm. This time it wasn't just the weather that unsettled Sarah, it was James. Since his confession, something had shifted in him, and she could sense the growing unrest. He had been quieter than usual, his eyes always drifting toward the sea as though it called to him, taunting him with memories he couldn't escape. That evening, Sarah arrived at the clinic only to find James's bed empty. Panic gripped her chest. She hurried outside, scanning the shoreline in the dimming light, and there, on the docks, she saw him. James was preparing his boat, his movements steady and deliberate. "No!" Sarah's voice rang out as she sprinted toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you doing?" James paused, his back to her, hands gripping the ropes of his boat. "I need to go," he said, his voice flat. Sarah stepped closer, her breath catching. "You can't. There's a storm coming. You won't survive out there." "I wasn't supposed to survive the first time," he muttered, finally turning to face her. His eyes were hollow, filled with a deep, unshakable resolve. "Maybe this time I won't." Sarah's chest tightened as she realized what he intended. He wasn't planning to return. He was seeking something. Atonement, perhaps, but at the cost of his life. She couldn't let that happen. "No," she said, her voice firm. "You don't get to choose this. Not like this." James hesitated, but the storm was closing in, and time was running out. The winds began to howl as the storm approached, whipping the waves into a frenzy. James stood by the edge of the dock, his boat rocking against the rising tide, ready to set sail into the darkness. But Sarah wasn't going to let him go, not this time. Without thinking, she grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the boat. "You don't have to do this," she shouted over the roar of the wind. "This isn't how you find peace." James wrenched his arm free, his face twisted in anguish. "There's nothing left for me here, Sarah. Every day, every night, I live with what I did. I can't change it. I can't take it back." "You can't change the past," Sarah said, stepping closer, her voice thick with emotion. "But you're still here. You survived for a reason. You have a chance to make something of what's left. Don't throw that away." James faltered, his eyes flickering with uncertainty, but the storm's grip was tightening. The waves crashed harder against the dock, and the sky darkened with the looming tempest. There was no time to argue. Sarah knew what she had to do. "I'm not letting you go out there alone," she said, and before James could respond, she turned and sprinted toward the helipad. The helicopter was their only chance. Within minutes, the blades whirred to life, and Sarah coaxed the machine into the sky, battling against the powerful winds. She spotted James's boat below as he drifted further out to sea. She lowered the chopper, rain pelting against the windshield, and steadied it just above his boat. "Get in the harness," she yelled over the radio. James hesitated for only a moment before grabbing the line. But as he clung to it, lightning split the sky, striking dangerously close. The helicopter lurched violently, and the next thing Sarah knew, they were falling, plunging into the sea. Cold water enveloped her, the shock of it seizing her lungs. But she forced herself to swim toward James, who was already struggling against the angry waves. Together, they fought the current, battling the elements, until they reached a small rocky island nearby. Exhausted, they collapsed onto the shore, breathless and shivering. but they were alive. The storm raged on around them, but on the small rocky island there was only the sound of their heavy breathing and the relentless crash of the waves. Sarah and James lay side by side, soaked to the bone, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and cold. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was James who broke the silence first. "I should have just let it end," he whispered, staring up at the dark sky. "I thought, maybe if I went out there, I'd finally make things right." Sarah turned to face him, her voice soft but firm. "Running away doesn't make anything right. It just keeps you trapped." James clenched his jaw, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. "You don't understand. I was the one who—" "I do understand," Sarah interrupted, her voice more forceful now. "I lost someone too, remember? My brother. I blamed myself every day for not getting to him in time. But I learned something, James. That guilt, it'll destroy you if you let it. It almost destroyed me." James's eyes flickered, his defenses breaking. "How did you live with it?" "I didn't. Not at first. I ran from it just like you. But you can't run forever," she said, her voice softening. "Eventually you have to face it." James closed his eyes, the tension in his body finally starting to release. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Sarah whispered, "and I'll be here with you." For the first time in years, James felt something shift inside him, a small glimmer of hope. Weeks passed, and the storm that had nearly claimed their lives seemed like a distant memory. The island had returned to its usual rhythm. Fishing boats on the water, the wind carrying the salty air through the small village. But for Sarah and James, everything had changed. James had started to rejoin the community. Slowly, at first, helping with small repairs at the docks, exchanging quiet words with old acquaintances. The isolation he had once embraced was beginning to fade, replaced by a cautious openness. People welcomed him back, treating him not with pity but with quiet understanding. Sarah watched from a distance, a quiet satisfaction settling in her heart. She had seen the change in him, seen the way he was learning to forgive himself, little by little. They spent their days together, often walking along the shore in silence, the sea no longer a source of pain, but of reflection. On a particularly calm morning, Sarah stood beside James, watching the horizon. The future still felt uncertain, but they were both ready to face it, side by side. "You saved me," James said softly, his voice filled with something new, gratitude, and maybe even peace. Sarah smiled. "We saved each other." And together, they stepped forward into the new life they had fought so hard to reclaim.